Okay, Sobel friends and family, we're going to continue with the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly prescribing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Again, what the heck does that mean? Let's unpack it. If you've ever seen anyone pulled over on the road by a police officer, stopped on the sidewalk, or have watched a detective show or a YouTube video or anything like that, you've seen the Fourth Amendment in action. This is a part of what's called due process. Okay, that's an important term for your rights. So make sure you're listening and paying attention. Officers and detectives must have a reason to stop you, ask you questions, have you empty your pockets, search your property, or even have you step out of the car. They have to have a reason. Much of the time, the officer must have written permission from a judge to arrest a citizen or search their property. That permission has to be based on evidence, and it has to state what can be searched. That's called a warrant. Sometimes a police officer might witness a crime or have a reasonable suspicion that a crime has taken place or is about to, in which case they don't necessarily need a warrant. That's called probable cause, which is still based on evidence. Okay, they have to base that on evidence. Now, if you guys have any questions during this time period, whether it's in the last segment of videos or during this video, please write them down and send them to me. We may have, and this is up in the air still, we may have a video session with somebody who is really knowledgeable about these things and uses them in action, former police officer. So these are questions I would like to share with him before we get started so that you have a better idea. Okay, so if you have any questions, please write them down and make sure you send those to me. The Fourth Amendment was written because of a practice used in the colonies and even Great Britain. Authorities could obtain a general warrant which allowed them to search a person and their property at any time without a reason. Some officials use that as a way of going after people they don't like. Just because you don't get along with someone doesn't mean they don't have the same rights as you. You're growing up with a lot of new technology, and the world is more connected than ever. Today, the government has the ability to listen to phone calls, read our emails and text messages, and see what websites we visit, and way more. Okay? While our founding fathers could never have imagined this new technology when the Fourth Amendment was written, it doesn't change the fact that these things are protected just like any other property. Sometimes you might hear stories of persons refusing to answer questions or not allowing their property to be searched. Saying no to a police officer is not wrong. In fact, it's often the right thing to do. We want to be as helpful as we can, but we still have our rights, and it's important that we maintain their integrity. If an officer is asking you questions or asks to search your property, first ask for a reason. If they don't have one, say no politely and walk away. If they have a reason or probable cause, you should make sure you have a parent with you before you speak to them further. Be polite, and that's important, to be very polite, but be firm. Never be afraid to use your Fourth Amendment right. Even if you are under arrest, you still have rights. Here's a picture of an individual being questioned by a police officer. Okay. They have to have probable cause. That's the big thing. Okay. Amendment number 5. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy, of life or limb, nor shall compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Okay, so what is that? Again, what the heck does that mean? There's a lot there. We got to unpack a lot of stuff here. Okay, the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendments are all part of due process and are the longest of the 10. Let's take it piece by piece. The first part of the 5th Amendment refers to a capital or infamous crime in a grand jury. When a person is facing serious charges in federal court, a grand jury must review the evidence and decide if the person can be charged at all. The United States is the only country to use grand juries, and it isn't considered necessary in order to charge someone with a crime. Whether a person is charged with a crime by a grand jury or without, the government must have enough evidence to prove the accused's guilt. The next part refers to double jeopardy, which means that a person cannot face trial for the same crime twice. If the government is not able to prove a person's guilt in the first trial, a person cannot be forced to face a second trial. If they have been found innocent, then they are free to return to their life. There are some rare exceptions to this, but overall it stands as is. So once you're charged one way or the other, you can't be charged again. Next part might sound familiar to you. Have you ever heard of someone taking or pleading the 5th? I plead the 5th. This means that an accused person may choose not to testify in a trial if they believe that there is a chance that they could incriminate themselves. This also is where, and we saw this with the Supreme Court, your Miranda rights come from. Okay? Remember that when you get arrested or stopped by the police and they actually take you into custody, they read you your Miranda rights, which basically say that anything that you say, right, they can use against you. So basically what they're telling you to do is, they're kind of giving you some advice and saying, be quiet, because whatever you say, they can use against you. So that's something to consider with your rights. Now, one thing you should recognize is that who are these amendments for? Okay, I'm going to give you a second. All right. Who are these amendments for? Is it for the executive branch? Is it for the judicial branch? Is it for Congress? Is this for the government? Who's this for? I want you to think about that. It's for you. It's to protect you. Come here. Come here. Lay down. Lay down. Lay down. Good girl. Lay down. In other words, a person may say something under oath that could prove their guilt. Whether they intend to say it or were tricked by a question, the Supreme Court has also ruled that choosing not to answer for this reason or any other reason is not proof of guilt. It's natural to refuse answering questions if we could prove our own guilt. The government cannot force you to answer questions at trial. Remember, life, liberty, and property. The Fifth Amendment protects these three things until a person is found guilty or innocent. A person may not be harmed. A person may not have their rights taken from them. A person may not have their property taken from them until after their guilt has been proven, and if it is necessary. So, like we saw in the 1920s, and you guys haven't learned about this in 7th grade yet, but we learned in the 1920s where they would just beat people. They would beat them senseless until they would talk or admit guilt. They can't do that. Okay, that is against your Fifth Amendment. Outside of court, the government may not take a person's property without compensating them properly. We talked about this a little bit with like building new roads. People have to compensate. The government has to compensate you for taking your property. If the government were to take your home, they must pay you fairly for it. This is called eminent domain. And while it is in the Fifth Amendment and is widely practiced, there are many that wish to see the practice end. Even though you are compensated, you may not want your property taken at all. Let's take a deep breath and move on to the Sixth Amendment. We're halfway there. Amendment number 6. Here's the text. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation to be confronted with the witness against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense, or her, or their. The Sixth Amendment refers to the actual trial process. Okay, the actual trial process. So when you are in court, okay, here's a little picture of that with the judge and this little person with the halo over their head being all innocent. Okay, each of us have a right to a speedy trial. It wouldn't be fair to arrest someone and then leave that person in prison for months or even years. A jury is selected at random from the community, and they are the ones who decide if someone is innocent or guilty. Now, when they select a jury, a lot of parents can probably talk to about this with their kids. Ask your parents if your parents aren't watching with you, if they've ever been selected to be on a jury. What happens in this process is the lawyers go through and they choose who they want to be in the jury. If they find that a person would be harmful to their case, they can eliminate them from the jury. What this is called is selecting a jury of your peers, which basically means that they're someone who's similar to you or similar to the defendant. So the defense counsel and the prosecuting counsel look at the jury and decide who will be the jury. When a person is arrested, they must be told the crime of which they are accused, and they have the right to face their accuser and ask them questions during the trial. You also have the right to defend yourself, present your own evidence and witnesses, and have a lawyer help you make your case. In fact, if you don't have enough money to pay for a lawyer, and for a lot of people this is the case, lawyers are very expensive. If you want to have a good career, and you're really good at reading text, you're looking at Supreme Court cases, you're looking at these amendments, you're looking at laws that have been passed. Well, a lawyer is a good career. If you're good at proving someone innocent or guilty based on evidence, well, law can be a good career. It's very expensive to hire a lawyer. But here's the thing. If people can't afford to be a lawyer, they have what's called public attorneys. And these public attorneys will defend you if you can't afford to have an attorney. One thing to remember is that when the government charges you with a crime, it's the government's job to prove it in court. It's the government's job to prove it in court. It is the government's job to prove your guilt. Remember that in the United States, a person must always be thought of as innocent until they are found guilty by a jury. This is called the burden of proof. Burden of proof. The government has to prove you guilty. You're innocent until proven guilty. Just because a person is arrested does not necessarily mean they are guilty. It's up to the government to prove it. Until then, they must be thought of as innocent. Okay, so that's amendment number 6. Amendment number 7. In suits at common law, where the value in controversy shall exceed $20. Now, this is very old. Okay, keep in mind, this was written by the founding fathers after the Constitution was passed. Okay, remember that when we had the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, it was the Anti-Federalists who were pushing for these things. This was, there were like 3 states that had decided not to sign and to ratify the Constitution. And so part of what persuaded them to sign and ratify the Constitution was the Bill of Rights. And so that's what we've got here. Okay. Amendment number 7. In suits at common law where the value of controversy shall exceed $20, which at that time was a decent amount of money, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. Now, $20 might not seem a lot to you, but you have to remember that the 7th Amendment was written in 1789. That's over 200 years ago. $20 was worth a lot more than it is today. $20 only 50 years ago was worth a lot more. The 7th Amendment is rarely enforced and usually only at the federal level. Let's pretend that I offered to mow your lawn for $25. You agreed, but after I finish, you refused to pay me. I could file a lawsuit to have the court settle this dispute. Now, keep in mind, if you did that, it would cost you money because what would you have to hire? What would you have to hire? Come on, guys. What would you have to hire? Oh, there you go, a lawyer. Good job. All right. If it was in a federal court, I could request that a jury decide who was right, just like a jury decides if someone is guilty or innocent. But if the lawsuit was in the state court, like your local courthouse, it would most likely be a judge that decides instead of a jury. It's very important to remember, but most lawsuits are settled by a judge, not a jury. Let's look at Amendment number 8. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. This is an interesting one. The 8th Amendment is very short, but it's just as important as the rest. Let's pretend that you've been arrested and the judge assigns a bail, okay? Which is a sum of money that you may pay to be granted temporary freedom until your trial begins. Remember the 6th Amendment. You have the right to make a defense in court. It's much easier to make a defense if you're free to stay at home, meet with your lawyer, talk to witnesses, and conduct your own investigation. If you are unable to pay your bail, you may have to stay in jail. You can still make a defense, but it's much harder. Bail cannot be used as a punishment prior to a person's trial. It must be based reasonably upon the individual and the crime of which they are accused. Even today, many people are unable to afford bail and must sit in jail for months or even years until their trial begins. They could lose their jobs, their car, even their home while they wait. Many people today are fighting to make sure that bail is fair for everyone, and they are using the 8th Amendment as a reason why. Unfair bail is considered unconstitutional. In other words, it's a violation of a person's rights. Now, some crimes don't require being sent to jail. Your punishment may simply be paying some money to the government, which is called a fine. Think of like a speeding ticket. But just like bail, if fines are too high, someone who can't afford it could be put in jail, and they could lose their job or property again. Punishments cannot be cruel or unusual. You may be a criminal, but you still have rights. A punishment cannot be humiliating or painful or dangerous. Some prisons use to let prisoners go hungry or make them sit in the sun all day or force them in a dark jail cell with no one to talk to for months or years. Punishment is not about revenge. Punishment is about justice for the victim. Restoring what was lost is far better than making someone suffer. We want to prevent crime, but we don't want to hurt people, and we certainly don't want to violate their rights. Someone who makes a mistake must make it right, but we must trust that they won't do it again. A community is based on trust, even trust for those who do something wrong. Okay, so it's not about punishment. It's about making sure that people get justice for their crimes. Amendment number 9. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by people. Just like the Eighth Amendment, the Ninth Amendment is extremely important, as short as it is. The Founding Fathers were worried that listing our rights would mean that no other rights would be protected. The government could make laws that restricted other rights simply because we didn't write them down. Remember, life, liberty, and property. You have the right to learn a new language, play an instrument, learn new skills, have a certain job, or even to create a brand new industry. No one can stop you from living the life you want, especially the government. The founders made it clear that just because it's not written in the Constitution, it doesn't mean that it's not a right. Remember that when we talked about Congress, Congress have certain powers that are written into the Constitution. Those are called enumerated rights. Okay, enumerated rights. Certain things are written into the Constitution. Certain things are not written into the Constitution, but that doesn't mean that you don't have that right. So when we look at the amendments, this is saying that the enumeration in the Constitution, the things that are written down, are rights that you have. But it doesn't mean that you don't have other rights that are implied or not written at all. Okay? Founders made it clear that just because it's not written in the Constitution doesn't mean it's not right. Not a right. That's why we're able to add additional amendments to the Constitution. There are 27 amendments altogether, and we can always add more. The Bill of Rights is only the first 10. Some of the other amendments are about the structure of the government. 22nd Amendment limits the president to only 2 terms, which means he or she can't be elected more than twice. The 25th Amendment is about the line of succession, which talks about what to do if the president is no longer able to serve. Others reaffirm the rights of people. The 13th Amendment makes it illegal to force anyone into slavery. You can't own another human being. Part of life, liberty, and property is something called self-ownership. Only you are in control of your life. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't listen to our parents or our teachers, but we have to be wise enough to know when these rights are being violated. Remember, life, liberty, and property. These are important things in your amendments. You can always work for someone voluntarily and agree on payment. That's called a job. But no one can force you, especially not the government. Another important amendment is the 19th Amendment, which made it clear that a person's gender should not keep them from voting. Before this amendment was passed in 1920, women were not allowed to vote. Women possessed the same natural rights as men, and the Constitution was changed to make that clear. Who you are as a person, no matter your age, gender, race, religion, ethnicity, or sexual orientation, does not change your rights. To learn more, you can find the entire Constitution at your local bookstore or library or online. I've provided you guys with links to look at the Constitution. You can even find copies small enough to fit in your pocket or download a copy on your phones. You can always have it with you. All 27 amendments are at the end of this book too. You can read each one and discuss it with your parents and teachers and even your siblings and friends. It's very important that everyone learns their rights. Okay, this is the last one that we're going to go over. The 10th Amendment has to do with states' rights. Here it is. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. Some of the founders were worried that by listing our rights as a people, the federal government would appear to have more power than actually given to it by the Constitution. So the 10th Amendment was written to make clear that the government is bound by the rules of the Bill of Rights and the powers granted to it by the Constitution. Any power not granted to the government is a matter for each individual state to decide on. That's why each state has its own constitution. Again, when we talk about the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, the Anti-Federalists wanted states to have power. And I think this is a compromise. Anything not handled by the United States government or the Constitution, those powers fall to the states. We have to remember, however, that based on the articles that we read in the Constitution, the United States Constitution, if something directly opposes constitutional law or the laws, then the government has that power. The most important job of the government is to protect our rights as free people. The most important job of the people is to ensure the government doesn't violate our rights. People interpret our rights differently, and that's okay, but we can all agree that we have the duty to protect our individual rights. This means that the government will not have the power to do certain things, but each of us as individuals and communities do possess the power to create value and prosperity for each other so long as we're willing to do. Okay? These rights, and I'm going to wrap this up for you guys as my dog gets in the way. Lay down. These rights are a natural part of being a human. That's why we have the Bill of Rights. It protects your human rights. Okay? So, no matter who you are, what your age is, what your color is, what your, how much money you have, how much money your parents have, how much, whatever trouble you've been in the past, you have rights. And so it's important to remember that. And, I wanted to kind of take a look at this so that you can defend those rights. So,